Hello and guten Tag, mein Freunde! I'm Peter and here I'm telling you stories about the most interesting European cars of the 80s and 90s. Today we are talking about the car that had many legends and misconceptions around it, and many wrongfully think of it as a fake Porsche, the Porsche 924. But before we start, don't forget to subscribe to my channel and click that bell to never miss a new video. And if you are already subscribed, thank you so much! Now, let's get back to the car. The Porsche 924 was produced from 1976 to 1988, and just over 152,000 cars were produced. This number is far below sales figures of Macan, Cayenne, and even Panamera. But we need to remember that Porsche was a different, rather small company in the 70s and 80s. And for that time period, the 924 was a bestseller for Porsche, with sales equal to the sales of the iconic 911, or even exceeding them, depending on how you count and what model years you include. The 924 was produced in a former factory of NSU, which became the factory of Audi, belonging to Volkswagen. And to understand how and why it happened, we need to take a look at the history of the car. There are a lot of misconceptions and legends about the 924 and its history. I'm going to try to tell you the most objective version of this story. But if you think that I got something wrong, feel free to tell me about it in the comments below. The 924 was born as the result of the joint venture between Porsche and Volkswagen. Porsche and Volkswagen always were closely related to each other. The Volkswagen itself was created in the 1930s mainly by Ferdinand Porsche and, well, Adolf Hitler. Porsche did a lot of engineering works for Volkswagen throughout decades and often used Volkswagen parts in their own cars. And today this connection is even closer. Volkswagen owns the brand Porsche, and the main shareholder of Volkswagen itself is an investment holding of the Porsche family. These two companies have always been in a kind of family relationship, with all related pros and cons of it. By the beginning of 1970s, Porsche and Volkswagen had also an experience of collaborative production of a car in a joint venture between them. The Porsche 914, known as Volkswagen Porsche 914 in some markets, was produced from 1969 to 1976. The history of the creation and sales of the 914 was full of scandals and disappointments for both parties. There are a lot of videos about it on YouTube, for example, the one from Big Car channel. I recommend you to take a look at it to get better understanding of the complicated relationship between Volkswagen and Porsche at that time. Anyway, what's important for us is that Porsche and Volkswagen already had a car produced together by the middle of the 70s. And, despite all road bumps and mutual claims, they could agree on something and do things together. The 914 was sold not bad, but it wasn't a very modern car already, with its air-cooled engine. Both Porsche and Volkswagen understood that they would need a replacement soon, so the work on the new car, that ultimately became the 924, began. One of the misconceptions about the 924 is that Porsche developed it specifically for Volkswagen, only as an engineering consultant for a Volkswagen project. That's not true because the car was created in full accordance with Porsche's new design and engineering concepts of the 70s. It was designed the same way as the Porsche 928, which was designed and built by Porsche itself. And the development of the 928 began earlier than the 924, although the sales of 924 started earlier than 928. The 924 had the same basic concept as the 928. It was a front-engine, liquid-cooled two-door coupe with 4 seats and transaxle transmission. Even the designs of both cars were very close to each other, with the shapes of their bodies and pop-up headlights. So, despite the fact that the 924 had an internal Volkswagen project number Volkswagen 425, it was intended to be sold as Porsche, side to side with the 928 from the very beginning. By the way, I already have a video about the Porsche 928, and I encourage you to watch it too, to better understand the context of the creation of the 924. After the oil crisis of 1973, the new management of Volkswagen became skeptical about launching a new sports car. At the same time, Volkswagen made a really huge investment bet by launching Volkswagen Golf and Passat and new generations of Audi 80 and 100. They didn't have enough money to experiment with sports cars. So they decided to back off from the deal from Porsche, but on good terms. There is another possible misconception that I meet all the time. It says that Volkswagen decided to ditch the 924 in favor of its own Volkswagen Scirocco. The problem with this idea is the fact that Volkswagen never actually produced the Scirocco. It was made by Karmann, and, by one version of the story, was financed and developed by Karmann as well. There is another side to that story too, and I'm telling it in my video dedicated to the Volkswagen Scirocco. Check it out. Anyway, Volkswagen wanted to leave the joint venture with Porsche, and this was a big issue for Porsche. Porsche really needed a new entry-level car. All cars made by Porsche at the beginning of the 70s looked technically outdated by Porsche's management, and, what was worse, by customers. Their line of road cars consisted of only two cars. The 914, that was produced together with Volkswagen and didn't bring much money due to the specifics of the terms of the deal, and the 911, which, despite its legendary reputation, was already an old car with technologies rooted in the 1930s. I have to admit that I'm not a big fan of the 911s, particularly in their 1970s version, with old air-cooled engines and outdated and dangerous torsion bar suspension. It was just a dangerous and very unstable car with a huge tendency to oversteer and get off the road in fast corners. You can see this in a lot of videos from the 1970s. Obviously, Porsche couldn't care less about my own opinion, but unfortunately many potential customers in the 70s thought the same. The sales of this expensive car with a bad reputation were not enough for survival. Porsche addressed that issue by developing the 928 with a new modern engineering approach, and it was a really good car. But it was expensive, and Porsche really needed a cheaper entry-level car. So, when Volkswagen decided to leave the project, Porsche made a decision to continue development by themselves. The terms of the divorce were relatively amicable and mutually beneficial. Porsche partly compensated for Volkswagen's investments in the project. The car was developed to use many Volkswagen parts, so Volkswagen got some money from that. In addition, the car had an engine which was partly developed and made by Volkswagen. More about it later, that's a really interesting story. And the 924 was produced at the Volkswagen's plant in Neckarsulm, a formerly NSU plant that became an Audi plant in the 70s. So Porsche received an entry-level car interesting for customers, parts for it, and the production facility. And Volkswagen loaded its production capacities and got money from Porsche without marketing and sales risks. A totally win-win situation. And with that deal, the car was built, and its sales under the name of Porsche 924 started in 1976. There is another legend about the production of the car, by the way. Allegedly, Porsche proposed the Soviet government to assemble the 924s in Moscow, at the AZLK plant known for Moskvich and Aleka cars. But the Soviets refused for some reason. This legend is actually not as wild as you may think, and it may be plausible. Porsche did have strong connections with the Soviet automotive industry, and Porsche engineers helped Soviet engineers design some elements of cars and source some parts from the West. For example, they greatly helped Lada to create the Lada Samara, known as VAZ-2108 in the USSR. It's interesting that the door handles of the Lada Samara look exactly like the ones on the Porsche 924. Do you think it's just a coincidence or what? In 1979, Porsche launched the turbo version of the 924, replying to concerns about the performance and dynamics of the car. Turbo cars were produced until 1982. Then they were replaced by turbo versions of Porsche 944, except for Italy, where they stayed on sales for a year or more due to tax regulations. The 944 had a bigger 2.5-liter engine, and it was too expensive from the tax point of view in Italy compared to the 2-liter 924. In 1982, Porsche launched the 944 model, which was partly based on the 924, but it was heavier and larger. Despite its relation to the 924, I believe the 944 deserves a separate story someday. The 944 couldn't fully replace the 924 in the market, because the 944 was significantly more expensive. So, the basic non-turbo version of the 924 stayed in production for another 6 years. It was seriously updated in 1986, when Volkswagen stopped production of the engines for the 924, and Porsche had to replace them with a slightly derated engine of the 944. In addition, the car received a new suspension, changes in the power structure of the body, the range of small updates, and a new model name, the 924S. The last 924 was produced in 1988, when it was fully replaced by the 944 and later, in the 90s, by the Porsche 968 and Porsche 986 Boxster. The exterior of the Porsche 924 was designed by Harm Lagai, who later also designed the very interesting BMW Z1, Porsche Boxster, Porsche Cayenne, and many other interesting cars. The design of the 924 was created under the supervision of Anatoly Lapin, the chief designer of Porsche, who was responsible for the development of all Porsche's cars in the 70s and 80s. The car was built as a two-door coupe with a large opening rear window, which may justify calling this car a three-door hatchback. It had 4 seats, but in reality it was more a 2+2 arrangement, because the rear seats could comfortably accommodate only children. The general design ideas were the same as for the Porsche 928. They looked very alike from the side. But the 924 was significantly smaller than the 928, with 420 cm or 165 inches in length against 452 cm or 178 inches of the 928. The 924 had a huge wraparound opening rear window / trunk cover. It's interesting that without this rear window, the side profile of the 924 has some resemblance to the side view of the 914, despite the 914 being a two-seater mid-engine coupe. So Harm Lagai managed to maintain some legacy and consistency between the two joint venture cars. From the engineering point of view, the arrangement of the car was similar to the 928. It was a front-engine, rear-wheel drive, water-cooled car with the transaxle type transmission. The engines, however, were smaller than in the 928, but we'll get back to this later. The 924 could have a large sunroof as an option. It was a firm panel that could be removed completely and stored in the trunk. Without it, the car became practically a Targa. Turbo versions of the 924 had openings in the hood and in the front beige panel for better ventilation of the engine bay and air supply. Also, the 924 Turbo had a rubber spoiler around the lower part of the trunk lid. The same spoiler could be an option for regular cars and became standard for the non-turbo 924S in 1986. The 924 had very good aerodynamics for its time, with a drag coefficient of 0.36 for regular cars and 0.33 for turbo versions. From the technical point of view, the 924 was a little controversial. Designed to be produced together with Volkswagen, it used a lot of Volkswagen parts, particularly in the interior and chassis. The front suspension used parts from the Volkswagen Golf and Beetle, but it was completely re-engineered by Porsche. By the way, this was the first production Porsche with McPherson struts in the front. The rear suspension was still based on torsion bars, with parts from the Volkswagen Think and Transporter. It was old-fashioned, but it actually worked great in the 924 due to its very good weight balance. And speaking of this, Porsche perfectly understood the issue with the uneven weight distribution in the 911, turning the car into a powerful slingshot in the heads of not careful enough drivers in fast corners. So they decided to move the engine to the front. But this brought another problem. The rear of the car was too light. It was okay for the majority of other cars of the time, but Porsche was Porsche, and they were eager to reach perfection. The solution for this issue was already well known in racing cars of the 1960s, and some automakers, say Alfa Romeo, already used it in road cars. It was transaxle. Basically, it meant moving the gearbox to the rear axle and combining it with the rear axle in one block. This, together with the rear positioning of the fuel tank, gave the car an almost perfect weight balance with 52% of the weight on the front axle and 48% on the rear one. The same arrangement was used in the 928 and later in the 944 and 968. The brakes of the 924 were a technical step back even from the 914, because the sportish 924 had drum brakes in the rear, while the 914 had disc brakes all around. But those drum brakes from the Volkswagen K70, first developed by NSU in the 60s, helped to decrease the price of the car. Turbo versions had disc brakes at all wheels, but the owner could choose to replace them with drum brakes from the regular version to decrease the price, and many buyers of turbo cars did the downgrade to save money. The 924S in 1986 received new all-disc brakes from the 944. Inside, the car was rather simple for a premium car manufacturer, but it was spacious enough for two people and comfortable. The seating position was very low, it was almost like sitting on the ground. At the same time, the driving position was good and convenient. The standard version of the car was rather simply trimmed and didn't have many comfort features to save costs and decrease the price. But you could have many things as an option for additional money: electric windows and mirrors, electric seats, air conditioning, power steering, sunroof, and so on. Turbo cars and S version in some markets had some of those options as standard equipment. The safety features were minimal, with no airbags, no ABS, no traction control, or other safety features. But the body of the car was developed with safety in mind. The car had crumple zones and in general was rather safe in comparison with other cars of that time. It was a small sports coupe, so you didn't have too much space inside. The rear seats were very small, with almost no legroom, unlike the seats in the 928. The rear passengers didn't have enough headroom too, and the tall transmission tunnel didn't help with the interior space at all. At the same time, the trunk was spacious enough for everyday use of the car. It wasn't too deep because the transaxle took a lot of space under the floor, but it was wide and long. In addition, you could fold the rear seats and get a lot of room for your luggage or groceries. The interior of the car had a rather sporty look, with many gauges in the instrumental cluster and on the center console. The park and brake lever was positioned in a Le Mans style between the driver's seats and the driver's door, and the tachometer scale was turned upside down in a racing style. At the same time, many reviewers were disappointed that many interior parts were shared with Volkswagen Golf and other Volkswagen cars. The 924 was the cheapest car in the product line of Porsche, but still it was considered a premium car, and the standard interior without options didn't look premium at all. In addition, the quality of plastic was very bad. The plastic was firm and looked cheap, and the materials of the dashboard were not very long-lasting. It is difficult to find now a 924 without cracks on the dashboard. The simple decoration of the interior, together with the relatively weak engines of the first cars, created an undeservedly bad reputation for the 924 among journalists and some Porsche enthusiasts. And speaking of the engines, there is another large misconception about this car. You can meet statements that the 924 had an engine of the Audi 100 or even Volkswagen LT cargo van, and that's partly true. But only partly, and the whole truth is much more interesting. At first, the Porsche 924 had a 2-liter inline 4-cylinder engine produced by Volkswagen, but that engine was first developed by Daimler-Benz in the 60s for DKW cars. Daimler-Benz owned Auto Union company at that time, and DKW, or rather DKW in German pronunciation, was a part of Auto Union. Daimler-Benz developed a 4-cylinder carburetor engine under the M118 index and used it for several DKW cars. But then they decided to sell Auto Union and all its brands to Volkswagen. Volkswagen further developed that good and new at the time engine and gave it its own index, EA831. Volkswagen used it first in the Audi 80 and then in other its cars, including the Audi 100. Which I have another video about, and yes, the Volkswagen LT van. Volkswagen also sold that engine to American Motor Corporation, and it was used, for example, in the AMC Gremlin. Porsche used the base of that engine for the 924, but for the 924, Porsche very significantly redesigned that engine. They made their own engine head with a different camshaft, they replaced the crankshaft, and they used mechanical fuel injection instead of a carburetor. Widely speaking, Porsche left only the cylinder block, pistons and piston rods from the old Daimler Volkswagen engine, and all the rest was Porsche's own development. This allowed for a serious increase in the power output of the engine. The Volkswagen version produced only around 70 to 75 horsepower, and the basic naturally aspirated European 924 had 125 horsepower, a top speed of 204 km or 128 miles per hour, and 0 to 60 miles per hour in 9.6 seconds. For the American market, due to emission regulations and different gasoline type, the compression of this engine was decreased, that resulted in the power output from 95 to 110 horsepower in different years, a top speed of 180 or 190 km and 112 or 118 miles per hour and 0 to 60 in 11 or 12 seconds. The bright side of this was that the American versions could use low-octane gasoline, while European cars required Supreme 98 petrol. The turbo version of the same engine was more interesting. At first, it produced 170 horses in Europe and 143 in America. The top speed was 225 km or 141 miles per hour in Europe and 210 km or 130 miles per hour in America, with 0 to 60 in 7.8 or 8 seconds accordingly. Starting from 1981, the European turbo engine received higher compression, an intercooler, and additional 7 horses, so the total herd was 177 of them. The top speed now was 230 km or 144 miles per hour, with 0 to 60 in 7.7 seconds. In the middle of the 80s, Volkswagen stopped the production of the 2-liter engine, so Porsche had to use another engine in the 924. They took the 2.5-liter inline 4-cylinder naturally aspirated engine with multi-point fuel injection from the 944, deforced it a little mainly for marketing purposes, and used it in the 924. This engine was essentially a half of the 8-cylinder engine of the 928. The car received the index 924S and 150 horsepower in Europe, together with a top speed of 215 km or 134 miles per hour. The 0 to 60 time is different in different sources, from 7.5 to 8.5 seconds. American customers were 3 horses short, 147, and the top speed was 212 km or 133 miles, with the same 0 to 60 time. In 1988, Porsche updated this engine for the European market again, giving it 160 horses, a top speed of 220 km or 138 miles per hour, and 0 to 60 miles per hour from 7.5 to 8.2 seconds according to different sources. Basically, the 924S gave the driver the same performance as the Turbo 924 before, but it was cheaper, more reliable, and didn't have a turbo lag common for early turbo cars. There were also several special versions of the 924. Porsche actively participated in racing, including the 24 Hours of Le Mans series. So they had to produce road versions of racing cars for homologation. The largest such production was the Porsche 924 Carrera GT. 406 cars were produced in 1980 with 210 horsepower, a top speed of 240 km or 150 miles per hour, and 0 to 60 miles per hour in 6.5 or 6.9 seconds depending on who you trust most. Those cars are very desirable for collectors and very expensive accordingly. But that wasn't the summit yet. There were also the GTS version with 245 horsepower, the GTR, built for Le Mans with 375 horses, a top speed of 290 km or 180 miles per hour and 0 to 60 in 4.7 seconds, and the GTP with 420 horny ponies built in the quantity of just 2 cars, only for participation in the Le Mans racing in 1981. As I already mentioned, the transmission of the 924 was based on the transaxle arrangement. Initially, it was combined with a 4-speed manual gearbox from Audi. In 1977, it was replaced by the Getrack 5-speed manual transmission with a dog leg shifting arrangement, with the first gear to the left and back. The same year, a 3-speed automatic transmission from Audi became available as an option. This was the first fully automatic transmission available for Porsche cars. In 1980, the manual gearbox was changed to another 5-speed one with the traditional gear shifting pattern. Some drivers complained about a too hard clutch pedal and not sharp enough gear shifting due to long links between the gear lever and the gearbox in the back of the car. But in general, the gearboxes of the 924 were reliable and worked well. Now let's talk about the driving experience of the Porsche 924. I drove one back in the days, at the very beginning of the 2000s. A sister of my wife had a 924 and I drove it a couple of times. I believe it was a regular version of 1984 or 1985 imported from America. To be honest, I wasn't very impressed, and I preferred the 1991 Audi 80 that I had at that time. But now I understand that I probably drove the wrong version of that car, and in the wrong way. The full pleasure of the 924 opened to the driver at active driving and fast cornering, and I never went fast enough in that car. More advanced drivers loved the 924 for its perfect and balanced handling, very interesting and predictable, particularly in comparison to the Porsche 911 of the 70s. The 924 dealt with fast corners at high speed in a very satisfying manner. The driver first felt a little understeer, but then the rear suspension came into the game and turned the rear part of the car just for the right angle. But nothing was excessive, and the car didn't have a tendency to oversteer or skid the rear part unpredictably. The suspension of the 924 never raised any questions, and even those car journalists who gave the car mainly negative reviews rewarded high marks to its very balanced and well-handled suspension, making the car feel perfectly tuned, extremely stable, and predictable in corners. At the same time, some cars were not comfortable at high speeds due to vibrations caused by the transaxle and long drive shaft. The 924 was a relatively light and easy to drive car. Despite having a 4-cylinder Volkswagen-derived engine, it had a very nice sportish sound. On the downside, it was noisy inside the car, particularly because you had to keep the car on high revs to drive it efficiently. The 924 had a feelable lack of torque at low revs. But it really gave the driver the feeling of driving a sports car, and the 924 from the inside felt faster and more aggressive than it actually was. The negative side of the car, described by many reviewers, was its lack of performance. The 924 was designed as a sports car and looked as a sports car, particularly with the Porsche badge on the hood. Customers and journalists expected it to be fast and dynamic, and they were disappointed when they found out that the 924 was weaker and slower than they expected. The European version was not that bad. It couldn't compete with the 911 on a straight line, but 125 horses were not bad at all in the 70s for a car with a weight of just over 1000 kilos or 2400 pounds. It was not the fastest car, but it was reasonably fast. It was worse with the American version. 95 to 110 horses were not enough to meet high expectations. The car was slow and disappointing. This was underlined in virtually all American reviews, and this hurt the reputation of the 924, making it a fake Porsche. But the sales still were not bad at all. The 924 still was a Porsche, and driving a Porsche meant a lot for personal status in the 70s and 80s. And the price of the car allowed for a much larger audience to join the exclusive club of Porsche owners. The performance issues were solved with the appearance of the turbo version of the 924. The dynamic of that car was close to the performance of the naturally aspirated 911, and the handling of the 924 was actually better. So the 924 Turbo was a really interesting car for car journalists, the Porsche they were looking for. But for customers, it had one very important downside: its price. It was almost twice as expensive as the regular 924 and almost equal to 911, which had a better reputation and status impact. So, out of 150,000 cars produced, only about 14,000, less than 10%, were 924 Turbo. The naturally aspirated 924S was the best of two worlds. It was relatively fast and wasn't too expensive. In addition, it was a seriously reworked and modernized car that drove better than any other 924 before. At the same time, it was already an old car in the second part of the 80s. The 924 had been in production for 10 years by the moment of appearance of 924S. So, only about 17,000 cars were sold in 3 years before production stopped completely. The 924 was a commercial success for Porsche. It was its best-selling model for over a decade and brought Porsche a lot of money, which they really needed to update the 911 and to maintain their ability to produce high-quality, high-performance cars. The 924 had a difficult and controversial history of creation, surrounded by too many legends, misconceptions, and misunderstandings. But it was popular among customers, and it gave many people the opportunity to drive a car with a Porsche badge on it. Many people say that the 924 saved Porsche from possible bankruptcy related to the lack of cash in the 70s, and probably it did. But what it did for sure, together with the 928 and the consecutive 944, was changing the public opinion of Porsche from a niche small quantity manufacturer of expensive sports cars to more widely market-oriented company, making cars that people just love to drive. If not for the 924, we probably wouldn't have Porsche today. And even if we would, Porsche would have been different. The 924 was a controversial car, but from any point of view, it was a car that changed the automotive world of the 80s. The Porsche 924 of course was sold in the United States during the time of its production, and the US was the main foreign market for Porsche. So if you want to buy one in the US today, you can probably find it at your local market. Or if you want a more powerful version, you can import it from Europe. All those cars are older than 25 years, so you can legally import them to the US. The parts for the 924 are mainly available thanks to the unification of many of them with Volkswagen's ones, and the cars themselves had rather good quality that lasted. Rust is also not such an issue as for many other cars of that time. The 924 was hot galvanized. Before 1981, rust protection was applied only to the floors, but later it covered the whole body of the car. In the US, you now can find a running 924 from $1,500 to $10,000, with particularly good examples with low mileage, up to $15,000. But the Carrera GT may cost over $100,000 and usually appear at auctions. In Europe, the current prices for good examples go from 5,000 to 25,000 euros, with Carrera GT models around 70-75,000 euros. Surprisingly, turbo cars in general cost the same money as non-turbo ones. Those prices are higher than they were 10 years ago, when the 924 didn't have really much value. Those cars started to be appreciated recently. But the prices are still reasonable, and it's even safe to say affordable. Well, thank you very much for watching. If you owned or drove a Porsche 924, please tell me about your experience. Was that car fast enough for you? And did you enjoy its behavior in corners? Thank you very much for your comments and your stories. And if you like this video, please give me a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. New interesting stories are coming soon. If you want to support this channel even more and help me make new videos, you can buy me a coffee by the link in the description below. Or simply don't skip YouTube commercials on my videos. Danke schön, mein Freunde, and see you next time.